Welcome to Schools Not Out, your daily classroom for CSEC and CAPE students. Today's lesson is CAPE Economics. We'll be focusing on wage differentials. I am Abigail James. So, I'm sure by this, you are well on the way with your studies. I know there are so much things being said in the media about exam at this time, but I just want to remember, keep calm and keep studying. So today we're going to focus on the topic, as I said before, wage differentials. Here are a few of our objectives for today. So at the end of the lesson, students, you will be able to explain the concept of wage differentials, analyze imperfections in the labor market, explain the concept of compensating wage differentials, and we're going to look at the role of government, trade unions, employers association in the pricing of labor. So let's get right to it. Wage differentials. Now, as you hear the topic, you already have an idea, and based on the fact that you're also reviewing what wage differentials is all about. So let's get into it. Now, by definition, wage differentials is looking at the difference in wages between workers with different skills in the same industry or between workers with comparable skills in different industries or localities. So simply put, we are looking at why is it that persons earn different wages. So if you examine an organization, you'll have your general manager and their income is different, and you look at the secretary, her wages are different, and the office admin, different wages. And so we're going to explain all of that today. Now we're going to start by looking at our factors that cause wages to be different. And the first one here is differences in accumulated human capital. So we're talking about the fact that persons are being compensated for their level of education. So they have invested in earning their degree, their master's, their PhD, and so they are paid according to that investment that they have made in their education. A next factor is difference in skill levels. So the demand for skilled labor in manufacturing and service sectors, for example, grows more quickly than the demand for semi-skilled workers. In these sectors, you will find that you need certain specialists and persons with advanced training. Sometimes the training requires them to go abroad to learn new technology and new machinery, and then they have to be compensated for that level of skills. Continuing, it also pushes up the average pay level. So highly skilled workers are often inelastic in supply, and as a result, it raises demand and also it pushes up their going wage rate for a particular industry. So what you'll find is that you don't find a lot of these specialists. So if you look at a neurosurgeon, for example, they're not a dime a dozen. That person is specifically trained in that area. And so if you have to visit one of them, you know you're going to pay to see them, and it's not cheap. Now, just indulge me for a bit. Some of these persons here you know: MC Nuffy, Pretty Boy Floyd, Miss Kitty, and you have IT and Fancy Cat. Now, what you will notice here that these persons carry a special skill in terms of emceeing a show, promoting a show or an event. Now, they wouldn't ask a person like me to host their event because I'm a nobody in that era, in that sphere. I wouldn't be able to carry the vibes. The show wouldn't be lit it wouldn't be off the chain, right? So when you ask persons like these to host an event for you, because of the skills and the talent that they have, you have to pay them to host that event for you. Let us look at another factor. Differences in productivity and revenue creation. Workers whose efficiency is highest and ability to generate revenue for a firm will be rewarded with higher pay. So what you'll find is that individual, they carry a certain amount of income just by their presence being there, just by them promoting your product. So if you look to the side of the screen there, you have Usain Bolt, a famous athlete in track and field. And so he got a lot of sponsors, Puma and so on. He's now with Digicel. It carries a lot of clout. And so if they want him to continue to sponsor their company, they have to reward him with high wages. So you see here, it said top sports stars can command top wages because of their potential to generate extra revenue from ticket sales and merchandising. So that is one factor that will cause wages to be different. Employer discrimination. This is a factor that cannot be ignored, despite the fact that we have over the years, what will I say, clamor for equal pay legislation in the workplace. But we do have it from time to time where persons are discriminated based on their race, based on gender. So sometimes you'll find that a male counterpart may earn more than a female counterpart in the same industry, doing the same duties. You have persons being discriminated based on race. It should not happen. The person must be paid based on their training, their expertise, and their ability to function and do the duties that are required of them. But it is a factor, sad to say, it is a factor where employers can discriminate based on those issues and pay different wages. We have now trade union protection. Now we know that the role of the trade union is one, to protect the rights of their union members and also to bargain for higher wages. And so you'll find that in a particular workplace, for example, or an industry, persons who are not a part of a union may not get the same pay as those who are a part of a union who negotiated for higher wages. So many workers are in low-paid jobs, do not have trade unions acting on their behalf to protect them from the power of the employers. And so the employers will choose to pay them what they feel they should pay them. But if they are a part of a union, the delegate will step in and bargain on behalf of their workers for higher wages once the firm is able to afford it. Let's look at another factor. Another factor here is labor mobility. Now, labor mobility speaks to the ability of the workers to switch jobs. And we have two types of labor mobility. We have what is called the geographical mobility, and the ease to move from one region to another. So in the event that something happens and I can't get a job in Kingston, but because of my skill set and a job opens in Montego Bay, I can easily move from Kingston to Mobay to take advantage of that job opportunity. You have what is called occupational mobility, and it's the ease with which one worker can transfer from one industry to another. So what you'll find is that because of my skill set and my training, I can move from one industry to another once the jobs are available. So I don't have to do any form of retraining because I already have the skill set to move into that industry. So for example, I'm a teacher, but my degree is in management studies and accounting. If I choose to move out of the classroom and become an accountant, I have the skill set and I'm able to do so. So that is occupational mobility. Now let us pay attention to how wages are determined. Now you will recall the regular workings of the market of demand and supply, the two forces, or what they call the invisible hands that manipulates the market. Now, the demand curve, as you know, it's downward sloping, and the supply curve. The demand curve here represents those who will demand labor, which will be your employers, and the supply curve, this upward sloping curve, will represent the employees, those who are willing to supply their effort for work for wages. So wherever they meet in the market under the perfect competitive situation, then wages are determined and that level or quantity of workers will be employed. So just to go over that again, the demand curve represents our employers and the supply curve represents our employees. Keep that in mind because we're going to go back to this diagram again. And so wherever they meet or come to an equilibrium, that will determine the market wage rate. And the Q here represents the quantity of labor that will be employed at that wage rate. Now, we mentioned previously that due to supply elasticities, that wages will differ depending on your elasticity. So in this situation here, I hope you are seeing where the demand curve is here and the supply here for this particular type of labor is steep. You'll notice that the wage rate is higher than this diagram here, where the demand curve intersects a relatively flatter supply curve and the wage rate here is much lower. Now, a steep supply curve will indicate that the supply of this particular skill set it's not very popular. There are few, and so they can demand higher wages. And a much flatter supply curve will indicate that this skill set here, it pretty much what we call dime a dozen. Everybody have that basic qualification, and so the wage rate here will be much lower. I hope you are grasping. Now we want to look at, because we know in the real world, it is not perfect. There are imperfections in the labor market. And so we want to look at the different labor market imperfections. So there are the monopsony, trade union, shifts in the demand and supply of labor, employers, association, compensating, or what we call equalizing wage differentials. So we're going to move right on into looking at the monopsony. Now the monopsony, as it says here, is in an imperfect labor market, a sole buyer of labor is called a monopsonist, and it occurs when there's just one buyer of labor in the market. So once upon a time, when we had Caribbean Airlines, it was the main purchaser of pilot services in the Caribbean. Now, this kind of power allows the firm to set wages or lower wages and also limit the quantity of workers that they employ. Because, again, as it says, they are the sole buyer of labor in that particular market. Now let's look at the demand curve for or the situation that occurs in this scenario. So here, the demand curve for labor, it is here. You're familiar with the marginal revenue productivity curve, and the supply of labor is an upward sloping curve. That's this one here. It's also the average cost, or it's also referred to as your average wage rate. Now, the marginal cost of labor is usually higher than the average cost of labor because in order to attract a new worker, higher wages must be paid. And not only must be paid, but all the other workers in that industry must receive the higher wages also. All right, let's go again. The marginal cost, here is that diagram, here's that curve, is higher than the average cost of labor because in order to attract new worker, higher wages must be paid and all the other workers must receive that higher wage. So they can't pay that worker alone the higher wages and ignore the other workers. So, again, we know that all firms are profit maximizing firms. So they will hire labor where, and I'm sure you're saying, where marginal revenue, or in this case, where your marginal revenue productivity is equal to your marginal cost. So here it is, where your marginal cost is equal to your marginal revenue. So here it is at Q2, that is the amount of labor that will be hired. Workers are paid now at the average cost or the average wage. So you go up and you touch the average cost or the average wage and you will get your wages at wage 2. That is what they will be paid. Please note that if the firm was operating in the perfectly competitive labor market, equilibrium would not be here, but equilibrium would be right here, where supply is equal to demand. So they would have hired at Q1 and the wages would have been at W1. I think I need to do that again so that you understand the diagram. So the profit maximization rule applies where marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost. So this is your marginal revenue curve, marginal cost. This Q2 represents the quantity of labor that will be hired. It is associated with this level of wage rate at your average cost curve W2. However, if it was a situation where it was a perfectly competitive market, meaning the market forces were able to determine wages without any interference, it would have been where your marginal revenue or your demand curve is equal to your supply curve, wage 1 and Q1. Whew. I know that was a mouthful, but please, ladies and gentlemen, be revising. That's the only way you're going to get it. And of course, as you know, if we do the exam, it's multiple choice. You don't have time to write around it. You must know the right answer if you see that diagram. The second imperfection has to do now with our trade unions. As we know, the role of the trade union is to bargain for higher wages, and those wages are usually above what we call the equilibrium wage rate or the market wage rate. So before the trade union, wages were determined by the market, demand and supply of labor. However, the impact of higher wages will have a negative impact on the labor market. And I know the diagram is there, but I'm going to go to the board and show it to you in a simplified manner. So we're looking now at the impact of the trade union. we have our wage rate and our quantity of labor. Demand for labor, and I said to you before, it represents our employers. And we have our supply, those who are willing to supply or make available their effort for work. By itself, they will negotiate a wage rate. Let us say it's $100. And at $100, 50 persons will be employed to this industry. However, workers will say, boy, can't live on that $100, cannot do anything. And they go to their union, they go to their delegates, and they negotiate with their employers. And they, of course, are negotiating for higher wages. So they said, no, man, you can do better. Instead of $100, pay us $200. So it is above the equilibrium wage rate. So we have our $200 here. At $200, look what happens. The first interaction is with whom? That is correct, our employers. At higher wages, our employers say, I can't keep 50 of you. At higher wages, I'll have to only keep 25 of you because I just can't afford it. Some of you will have to go home. We don't like to hear that word. At $200, however, the next interaction is with the employees, those who are willing to supply their work. So persons here that in this particular industry, persons are earning up to $200 and they want to work at this industry. So you'll find that 70 persons, or let me put 60 persons want to work at this industry. However, the employers are only employing 25. So what you'll find that this gap here represents excess supply of workers or persons who will be unemployed. Because demand here is low at higher wages in terms of the employers, but supply is much greater at $200 because persons are willing to work for more money. So back to our diagram on the chart here. So here you have it. Our workers will be willing to work for higher wages. We have an excess amount of workers, and that will represent unemployment. So the negative impact on the labor market is that sometimes when they negotiate, the trade unions negotiate for higher wages, it can result in a level of unemployment. Similarly, when the government intervenes in the market, so we have government intervention. So the market wage rate is determined by just the market forces of supply and demand. But the government will look into it and say, boy, at $3,000 a week, persons really can't afford the basic necessities of life. So they will step into the market and they will set what is called a minimum wage rate. What is the minimum wage rate in Jamaica? That's your research. I'm not telling you. You soon go out to work, you research it. And they set the minimum wage, and at that minimum wage, this intervention, linking it back to your topic of demand and supply, is referred to as a price floor. It's the legal minimum that must be paid to a factor, in this case, labor. So the minimum wage is set. All employers must adhere to it. But again, it's going to lead to labor surplus, where supply of labor is greater than the demand for labor, which results in unemployment. So, yes, the government is doing a good thing, trying to protect the rights of the citizens, but as I said to you again, as I prove it and show it to you here on the diagram, it can result in a level of unemployment. let's now look at another factor. Shifts in demand and the supply curves and how they can affect wages. I hope you can see this on the screen. So if the demand for labor is constant, but there is a fall or an increase or a decrease, sorry, my apologies, an increase in supply of that particular skill set, you'll find that it will force wages downwards. So here it is, that demand here is constant, supply decreases, wages fall, supply increases, sorry, wages fall, and you hire more but at lower wages. On this diagram here, you'll find that supply here is now constant, but there is an increase in the demand for that particular skill set. And so in order to have the workers that they need, once there's an increase in demand, wages are going to move from W to W1 to show that they are going to increase wages and hire more of that particular labor skill set. Our next factor here is looking at employers' association. So what you'll find is that the employers, they will sit and negotiate wages with the trade unions, and so they will meet in order to have a consensus on the wage rate that is in the collective interest. So they will have a sit-down session. Listen, this is what we can afford. We know times are hard. Our workers are saying they need more that they can provide for themselves and their families and to live comfortably. And so the trade unions and the employers will come to a consensus of how much wages they are willing to pay so that they don't have to lay off anyone. Sometimes persons have to, be a little bit flexible. I remember a statement that says sometimes half a loaf of bread is better than no loaf at all, because if wages are too high and the firms are not able to pay out those wages, they are going to lay off some of their workers. So what you'll find is that a few will benefit from the higher wages, and then some will just have to go home. Let us look at compensating, or what we call equalizing wage differentials. Now, these are wages. The wages are rewards that a worker will receive for the negative impact or the sacrifices of a job. So what you'll find is that higher wages are paid for dangerous jobs. So persons who do the offshore oil digging, or drillers, they call them. Persons who have to work in isolation and have to work extremely long hours. Persons who have to work overtime, way over the 8 hours, going into probably all 24 hours. They are just on the clock. They are to be compensated for that kind of negative impact or the sacrifices that they have to make on the job. So it is called compensation or equalizing wage differentials. I am going to look again at the government intervention and how their intervention in the market, even though that is for the benefit of the working population, it can create unemployment. So here we go again. On our axis here, we have our wage rate and our quantity of labor. Demand for labor, those who will demand labor will of course be our employers. And the supply, those who are willing to give their effort for work, they are referred to as our employees or our workers. Now left to the market alone to determine wages, The market may become at equilibrium at $4,000 per week. Now, the government, after doing their assessment, and of course, based on persons' feedback and so on, sometimes the survey that Statin will do and so on, will realize that at $4,000 a week, persons cannot sustain themselves adequately in terms of providing their food, clothing, shelter, the basics that they need. However, that is what the market, if left alone, will determine the wage rate to be. And probably at $4,000, the market will employ 500 workers at that rate. The government can intervene in the market and they will set a legal minimum wage, meaning that this is the wage rate that all workers minimum must be paid, and the firms must live up to that obligation. So let us say that they set the minimum wage at $7,000 per week. At $7,000 per week, people are excited. Woo! Nice. But there is an impact of that decision on the market. The impact is, and look closely at the diagram, the first interaction at $7,000 a week is with our employers. At $7,000 a week, employers say, I cannot keep 5,000 workers. I will only keep 400 workers because that is what I can afford. Right? Remember also the concept of the demand curve, that if prices increase, quantity in here demanded for labor is going to fall. When we look again at the impact of $7,000 per week on the supply curve, which represent our workers, our employees, more persons want to supply their effort in work. So you'll find that 600 workers are clamoring, sending letters of application and resumes, all of that, to this particular industry because the wage rate has increased from $4,000 per week to $7,000 per week. So what you'll find is that supply here of workers is greater than the demand for workers. It leads to what we call excess supply, or a surplus, and it also signifies that there is now a level of unemployment in the market because of the new wage rate per week. Bringing in your previous knowledge, when the government sets this minimum wage, is also referred to as a price floor. The legal price, minimum price that must be charged for this factor of production, and in this case, it is labor. So I hope it's much clearer for you now that the impact or the government intervention in the market will have this impact on the market. Now to move quickly, let us just recap. So today we looked at wage differentials, and we said that it's looking at the difference in wages between workers in the same industry or between industries. We also looked at some of the factors that will impact wage differences. So human capital, your education and training, your skills level, the union, the trade union, government intervention, if there are shifts in demand and supply for labor, the impact of the employers association, and the compensating or equalizing wage differential. I think we have time just to squeeze a question. It says, under this CSM agreement, an electrician from Jamaica now works as a plumber in Trinidad. What type of labor mobility? Is it occupational, horizontal, vertical, or geographical? Yes, you are right. It is C. It is occupational and geographical. So that's all for today for Cape Economics on wage differentials. I hope you have grasped most of the points we have discussed. Until next time, I am Abigail James.